when your world collapses. Finding stability after a major loss, a cold, hollow somatic panic is vibrating through the center of your chest right now, leaving you feeling structurally lopsided, unstable, and profoundly disoriented in the dark. You are lying perfectly still, yet your heart is racing as your mind continuously reaches into the empty, silent spaces of your life, grappling with the sudden fracturing of a long-term relationship or a shared future that has completely collapsed around you. There is a terrifying sensation of being left physically unbalanced, as if a vital weight-bearing wall has been violently torn away from your life's design, leaving your internal framework exposed to the cold wind of absolute uncertainty. Your breathing is shallow and strained, caught in the tight scaffolding of your ribs, because your nervous system is still actively braced to hold up the heavy timber of a partnership that is no longer there to support you. The phantom weight of what used to be a shared architecture has left you feeling structurally broken, split down the center and deeply isolated in your current environment. Let the specific, rugged atmosphere of this quiet room begin to ease the frantic, lopsided tension within your upper chest. The air surrounding your bed does not carry the typical softness of the lower valleys. Instead, it is infused with the crisp, clean scents of sheared pine resin, cold alpine slate, and the damp, stabilizing aroma of mountain clay turning over after a hard rain. Beneath your body, the mattress provides a wide, horizontal shelf of solid slate, a dense and unyielding foundation that has absolutely no need for a companion wall to maintain its equilibrium. This surface offers a permanent baseline that is perfectly designed to catch you exactly as you are, completely removing the requirement to look balanced, strong, or put together for the eyes of the world. Right now, dear friend, you are safe enough to soften into this deep shadow. You are not broken because your structure has been altered by a sudden departure, and the terrifying void you are navigating tonight is not a personal failure. It is simply the natural, heavy resonance of a frame that has suddenly lost its accustomed lean. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a profound, comforting paradox that lies at the very heart of this emotional dislocation. The agonizing imbalance you are feeling right now is not actually a sign that your individual strength has evaporated. We are taught to believe that our safety depends entirely on our ability to maintain a symmetrical, two-sided architecture, leaning our lives against another person to form a stable, protective apex in the wilderness. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that when a shared roof truss falls apart, the remaining timber suffers not from an inherent lack of structural integrity, but from the residual habit of leaning into an empty space. The pain is the muscle memory of the lean, the internal momentum that continues to strain toward an absent support beam. The moment you stop trying to keep that ghost wall erect through sheer personal willpower and allow your timber to drop completely, you discover that your solitary frame possesses an independent, horizontal equilibrium that can rest directly upon the bedrock without needing an external prop to remain whole. Maybe you have felt this too during the long, dark hours of the evening, the relentless, exhausting loop of wanting to let go of the grief, while simultaneously feeling that if you stop analyzing the reasons for the separation, you will remain permanently shattered and adrift. We treat our broken future as a total architectural disaster, spending our night hours replaying the final conversations, examining the cracks in our history, and trying to rearrange the pieces in our heads to see how we could have built it differently. This reaction only adds a heavy secondary layer of psychological fatigue to the genuine raw ache of a lonely heart. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool, penescented air expand into the very bottom of your lungs, moving past the lopsided ache in your sternum, entering the quiet, unmoving mass of your lower abdomen. You do not need to force anything to change its shape right now, and absolutely nothing is required of you to be held securely by the earth. Imagine leaving behind the ruined, chaotic construction sites of the lower valley and ascending into the high, quiet slate ledges where the subalpine air is completely still and unbothered by the dramas of ownership or design. In this dark, unmapped sanctuary, a massive, hand-hewn central timber roof truss rests flat across a permanent shelf of solid granite, having fallen from an old, decayed shelter seasons ago. It has stopped falling. It has abandoned the exhausting effort of holding up the side planks, and it now sits in an independent, magnificent stability, completely balanced within its own massive weight. There are no expectations here, no contracts for you to fulfill, and no shared futures for you to manually stitch back together in the dark. There is only the cool, mineral reassurance of the mountain floor, and the immense peace of an architecture that knows how to hold an isolated form without demanding that it lean upon another. You have arrived at a baseline where you can finally drop the burden of your relationship history, stepping into a sensory world that allows you to trade the frantic panic of a collapse for the heavy, horizontal safety of an independent night. High upon the jagged, wind-scoured ridges where the subalpine forest gave way to sheer walls of blue slate, lived a young timber framer named Daisuke. For 5 summers he had worked side by side with his closest companion, hewing massive pine logs and raising complex, interlocking structures to shelter the pilgrims who climbed the high pass. They had designed their lives like a pair of matching rafters, leaning perfectly into one another to sustain a grand, symmetrical vision of a shared future. But when an unexpected, violent mudslide tore through the western ravine, the stabilizing earth beneath the western wall washed completely into the valley, and in the bitter winter that followed, his partner chose to abandon the mountain altogether, leaving for the coastal cities without warning. Daisuke remained behind in the half-consap's shelter, his spirit caught in a devastating, lopsided paralysis that made his chest feel hollow and heavy on the left side. Every night, as the freezing gales rattled the loose iron roofs, he sat staring into the dark vacancy where his companion's labor used to rest, his body physically listing to one side, completely unable to find an equilibrium within his own solitary frame. He felt fundamentally broken, ruined by the departure, convinced that an isolated timber had no inherent right to stand upright once its corresponding half had been removed from the mountain. Seeking some hidden method to stabilize his tilting mind, Daisuke carried his carpenter's pouch up through the freezing mist to the high exposed slate ledges where Master Juro spent his old age. Juro was an ancient trail carpenter who no longer built grand halls. He lived in a low stone lianto, using simple hand tools to reinforce the structural integrity of the primitive trail markers that guided travelers through the blizzards. When Daisuke arrived at the windswept clearing, the frantic, looping questions in his head were met only by the rhythmic, biting whisper of a small handad slicing through wet grain. The air up here smelled intensely of cold, shattered slate, wet moss, and the pungent, honeyed resin of freshly sheared pine timber. The old master was not working on a grand design. He was kneeling on a flat slab of gray rock, turning a heavy notched pine joinery pin over and over in his calloused palms. Daisuke stepped forward and bowed low, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps as the hidden reservoir of his grief broke through his defenses. He spoke of the terrifying void in his chest, the phantom weight of the shared future they had planned, and the agonizing midnight habit of replaying the final conversations to discover why the structural alignment had failed. He asked Master Juro to teach him how to rebuild the missing side of the wall, or how to hold his own muscles rigid enough to stop his frame from listing in the wind. The old carpenter listened to the entire confession without putting down his adze, his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden pin in his lap. When the young timber framer finally ran out of words, his ribs trembling with the cold residue of his panic, Juro did not offer a comforting phrase or an academic lesson. Instead, he picked up the notched pine joinery pin and placed its split, sticky surface directly into Daisuke's shaking hands. The pin was a substantial piece of heartwood, hand-carved with complex, interlocking notches that were meant to bind 2 massive square beams together at a critical corner. But as Daisuke turned it over, he saw that the dense wood had been split cleanly down the center, severed into 2 mismatched fragments along its internal grain by an immense, shearing mechanical pressure. Juro did not tell him to look at the vast mountain horizon. Instead, he led the young man to the rear of the clearing, where the skeleton of an old timber-framed storehouse stood abandoned against the slate cliff. One entire half of the structure had completely rotted away, its side posts resting in the mud, yet the great central ridgepole, a massive, 20-foot beam of ancient pine, did not crash into the rocks. It had dropped several feet during the initial collapse, finding a new, independent resting place directly across a wide, horizontal ledge of solid mountain granite. Master Juro reached out and struck the split pine pin with the flat of his hand, causing a small drop of old amber resin to ooze from the fractured seam. He looked into Dasuk's disoriented eyes, took his heavy wooden mallet, and lightly tapped the side of the leaning beam that still hung suspended over the empty air. The timber gave off a strained, groaning sound, vibrating under the unnatural tension of trying to hold its old angle without a wall underneath it. Then Juro pointed down to the massive central beam resting flat and broad on the granite shelf, solid, unbothered, and perfectly still in the mountain mist. "Look closely at the split pin you are holding," Juro said, his voice low and scraping like a wooden wedge being driven into a tight joint. The old trail carpenter asked a single quiet question that pierced straight through Dasuk's defensive calculations. Did this wood split because its own grain was weak, or because it was forced to hold together two structures that were already moving in opposite directions? Dasuk looked down at the severed heartwood in his palms, comparing its shattered seam to the massive central timber, resting flat on the granite bedrock. The pine pin had not failed out of structural unworthiness. It had broken because it had been driven into an unnatural apex, forced to bridge a widening gap between two separate halves of a building that the mountain was naturally pulling apart. The pain he had been carrying in his own chest was not the agony of a ruined core, but the continuous, exhausting strain of his own internal fibers trying to maintain a lean toward a support beam that had already dropped away. But the great horizontal ridgepole on the stone ledge was completely stable, wide, and secure within its own isolated mass. It did not need a matching rafter to keep it from falling any further. It had already hit the absolute baseline of the earth, and because it had abandoned the effort of leaning, it was the only timber in the entire valley that was entirely free from structural stress. A profound wave of emotional recognition washed through Dasuk's sternum, loosening the cold, protective knot that had held his lungs tight since the day of the mudslide. He looked at the massive pine beam resting flat on the dark slate ledge and realized that his entire internal struggle had been a frantic, impossible attempt to hold up a ghost architecture in the dark, believing that if he stopped bracing against the emptiness, his entire life would collapse into nothingness. He had viewed his solitary, unbalanced state as a permanent indicator of failure, completely blind to the reality that the fall had already stopped and that he was already being held by a deeper, unmoving shelf of natural rock. He saw that his individual frame did not require a matching rafter to possess its native equilibrium. Its presence was already absolute the moment it stopped reaching into the empty space. The alpine twilight was deepening across the high slate ledges now, the blue mist in the clearing blending into a calm, uniform charcoal gray. The sharp, clean aroma of the pine resin and the cold clay hung suspended in the heavy air, grounding Dasuk's awareness in the immense, uncelebrated safety of his own independent structure. Take a slow, unhurried breath, letting your own shoulders sink flat into this supportive surface, allowing your mind to rest upon the solid, horizontal weight of the timber as it settles into the quiet dark of the night. This old story from the wind-scored slate ridge is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding timber, or entirely numb to the very real ache of navigating a shattered relationship or a broken future. It is not an instruction to lock your heart away in a dark, roofless shelter, pretending that the sudden departure of a companion or the slow erosion of a shared dream does not leave a genuine, throbbing bruise across your identity. It is showing us something much quieter, a profound shift in our internal posture that allows us to inhabit our solitary frame without letting it become an object of constant, agonizing repair. When we sit in the dark and look at our Latinite emotional dislocation, we begin to see that the deep, suffocating exhaustion we carry does not actually stem from the empty space beside us. The true suffering, the knot that contracts your chest and turns your sleep into a trial, resides not only in what happened when the wall collapsed, but in the specific way the mind continues to hold the lean long after the support has gone. In our modern inner lives, what we call attachment is that frantic, hypervigilant urge to force our individual presence into an artificial apex that will guarantee absolute stability through another person. It is the desperate craving to remain perpetually locked into a two-sided design, a silent belief that if we can just brace our life layout against a partner, we will finally be safe from the threat of the void. This craving operates exactly like a heavy joinery pin driven into a shifting beam, continually straining our vital energy through endless loops of relational analysis. Believing that if we remain hyper-conscious of the other person's movements, we can prevent the final separation, we become like an apprentice who spends his vital nighttime hours frantically holding up a falling rafter with his bare hands, completely blind to the reality that trying to maintain an unnatural angle is what truly breaks our structural capacity to rest. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is the baseline vulnerability that life brings to our emotional architecture, the sudden text message that ends an era, the slow cooling of a long-term partnership, the heavy realization that two life paths are diverging, or the simple truth that human connections are subject to the same erosion as a wooden wall built in a mudslide zone. These moments are painful, and they leave a real stinging heat across our awareness. The second wound, however, is the massive edifice of personal shame, self-blame, and Latinite structural reviews that we build around that initial fracture. It is the secondary spiral where the mind convinces us that if we stop holding up the ghost of the connection or analyzing the failure for even a single hour, we are accepting total ruin and admitting to a lifelong failure. This continuous bracing of our own self-worth against an empty space is what truly depletes our body, trapping our nervous system in a permanent alarm that refuses to let the muscles soften. When we practice true mindfulness within our somatic self, we are simply learning how to view our isolated form through a cool, non-judgmental awareness. This awareness is the quiet, grounding quality of the mind that can notice the burning heat of an abandonment without choosing to step directly into the habit of self-loathing. It is the capacity to feel the lopsided ache in your sternum or the hollow sensation in your belly and say, there is a dense point of vulnerability here in my framework, rather than, I must aggressively fix this space before I am worthy of existing. By shifting our relationship with this empty space, letting go ceases to mean passive indifference or giving up on love. Instead, letting go becomes an act of immense, quiet sovereignty, the willingness to step back from the ruined construction site, allowing your individual timber to drop flat against the bedrock until the frantic urge to lean stops vibrating through your limbs. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the structural reality of the body, becomes a source of profound relief rather than a cause for dread. Every shared contract, every conventional standard of domestic safety, and every high-profile project of togetherness that we see in the lower valleys eventually loses its momentum, shifts its foundation, and yields to the changing earth. The relational configurations that seem so permanent and all-important during the building years are subject to the same tectonic movements as an old pine shelter standing in an alpine ravine. An accidental separation or a broken future cannot permanently destroy your internal integrity unless you continuously pick up the hammer to pin your spirit to a disappearing wall. Wisdom reminds us that the most heavily braced and interdependent structures quickly reveal their brittle nature when the mountain moves, while the heart that knows how to rest horizontally on its own granite shelf remains entirely secure. Compassion, in this sharp subalpine light, is the spacious clay that meets your emotional panic without turning your loneliness into a source of personal failure. It is the willingness to look at the disoriented, defensive part of your mind and recognize that this heavy loop of relationship review is not a defect in your spiritual character. It is simply a tired, primitive part of your survival biology that has been staying awake to protect your perimeter, believing that if it stops holding up the ceiling, your entire identity will be crushed beneath the rubble. By meeting this internal builder with a slow, heavy, and completely unbothered physical presence, you allow the frantic necessity to lean to dissolve, transforming the brittle desire for companionship into a dense, grounding mineral weight. In a moment, this horizontal clarity will move from an idea you listen to into a concrete, physical practice you can truly drop your entire weight into. The crisp, clean air within our quiet mountain clearing remains perfectly still, totally unconcerned with the grand structural displays of the lower valley. The fallen central timbers hold their immense mass in absolute, dignified silence, allowing the green moss to grow over their sheared grain without any need to justify their isolated position to a traveler. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the hot static in your temples sink flat into the mattress as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical relaxation. If it feels right, allow the physical boundaries of your body to spread wider across the horizontal surface, supporting you, surrendering your complete skeletal weight into the unmoving foundation that holds your frame tonight. There is no need to engineer an artificial stillness within your mind, nor is there any requirement to alter the simple, automatic rhythm of your breathing as it passes quietly across your lips. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool, subalpine air entering your lungs, unhurried and light, leaving a trace of clean pine resin as it exits your frame. With each slow horizontal exhalation, you might allow the sharp edges of your shoulders, your chest, and the small, hyper-vigilant muscles around your ribs to lose their tight configurations. Imagine your physical self sinking down into the dense, dark baseline of the mattress, dropping the bracing posture of the day completely, like a massive central timber that has finally dropped its lean and settled flat onto a solid shelf of mountain granite. As you lie here in the deep shadow of your room, you might shift your internal focus away from the vertical, straining territory of the upper throat and the jaw, allowing your center of gravity to settle deep into the base of your spine. For many hours, your vital energy has been pulled upward into a hot, vibrating knot of relational panic, tensing like wood under a heavy mechanical shear as you tried to manually hold up the ghost of a shared future. Right now, there is no need to force that momentum to vanish instantly. Even noticing the faint, rhythmic movement of your lower abdomen as it rises and falls is entirely enough to anchor you to the ground. You do not have to perform this meditation perfectly to prove your structural integrity to an invisible builder. There is no score being kept in this clearing, no penalty for carrying an isolated frame, and absolutely nothing you are required to fix before you are permitted to drop your effort into the dark. In this open, non-judgmental space of your own awareness, you might allow one specific, recurring thought or memory from your separation to appear without trying to fight its presence. Perhaps it is a sudden phrase from a final conversation that left you feeling completely lopsided, an empty space where a plan used to rest, or a persistent urge to stay awake to mentally reconstruct the architecture of your relationship history. Do not try to aggressively push this memory out of your head, and do not dive into its details to argue with the companion who has departed. Instead, if it feels right, you can name the emotional pattern softly to yourself, perhaps using the silent words holding the lean, bracing the ceiling, or measuring an empty space. Recognizing the habit in this gentle way is enough to create a small, cool distance between your core self and the heat of the grief. Once you have named the pattern, you might imagine taking that entire, burning narrative and placing it gently into the fractured center of the heavy, notched pine joinery pin that sits behind the old slate retaining wall. Let the split heartwood hold the entire weight of that broken future for you. In your imagination, you can reach down and touch that rough, resinous surface chilled by the high mountain mist, smelling of damp clay, and completely detached from the structural demands of the lower valley shelters. Gently, without any sense of anger or violence, you might allow your awareness to merge with that fallen timber, letting your self-image rest directly upon its unyielding, horizontal surface. There is no need to force a sudden emotional release, or to demand that your mind instantly love its solitary position. You are simply allowing the frantic necessity to lean to drop flat against the bedrock. Watch what happens to that image when you stop feeding the memory with the fresh energy of your analytical habits. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting within the heavy split mass of the pine heartwood, the erratic, straining tension of your overthinking naturally begins to lose its velocity. The dry, solid wood does not fight the emptiness, it outlasts it, holding your presence perfectly still within a dark, self-contained realm of mountain slate until the volatile anxiety naturally runs out of momentum. The urgent necessity to rebuild the missing wall begins to dissolve, replaced by the deep, horizontal density of a frame that is far too grounded to be broken by a sudden departure. The mind stops pulling against the void and begins the quiet, slow process of settling into an unshakable baseline of inner peace. If your mind occasionally drifts back into its old habit of reaching across the bed, or if a sudden wave of relational panic surfaces around your collarbones, remember that you can return to the cool, grounding texture of your breath whenever you are ready. There is no timeline you must follow tonight, and no one is asking you to promise your nervous system a state of permanent, immediate healing. True transformation does not happen by violently erasing your natural grief, but by realizing that your awareness is like the vast, dry subalpine clearing itself capacious enough to let the fallen timbers rest safely in the moss without needing to join them back together. Let each slow, unhurried breath feel like the natural grounding of a weight, allowing your limbs to become heavy, porous, and completely unresponsive to the urgent static of the daytime world. In a moment, our journey will return to the high slate ledges, following Daesuk as the seasons shift and bring a heavy winter blizzard that will test the true stability of his solitary heart. The deep, dark textures of the old carpenter's clearing will continue to open a path toward an absolute, indestructible form of inner sovereignty. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and encased in this protective shadow, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast, horizontal safety of the night. 3 full moons had traveled across the jagged gaps of the high ridge, frosting the exposed shale with silver before the heavy winter blizzards finally locked the high pass in an absolute, unmoving silence. Daesuk spent his long, solitary hours reinforcing the remaining framework of the old trail shelter, his hands slowly growing accustomed to the blunt weight of his tools, his breathing gradually finding the steady, horizontal rhythm of the stone shelf below. One frozen morning, as he was stacking firewood beneath the eaves, he heard a faint shouting coming from the lower ravine. Struggling through the waist-deep drifts, he discovered a traveling merchant and 2 young porters huddled desperately in the hollow of a collapsed slate wall, their packs frozen solid, their fingers blackened by the biting frost. Among them, wrapped in a tattered coastal cloak, was the very clerk from the timber guild who had originally drawn up the contract for his former partner's departure, the one who had handed Daesuk the empty, severed inventory sheets with a cold, dismissive smile down in the valley market. As Daesuk pulled the shivering men out of the snowdrift and guided them up toward the safety of Master Juro's clearing, his heart began to pump a hot, bitter current of reactive energy through his ribs. The old architectural wound flared up with a searing force, tempting him to look down upon this clerk, to leave him by the colder side of the hearth, or to use this sudden reversal of fortune to ease the lingering ache of his own abandonment. The mind immediately began to spin a complex web of vindictive justifications, telling him that this man's suffering was a form of cosmic justice for the callous way his shared future had been dismantled. When they finally reached the low stone lianto, Daesuk's fingers gripped the broad, flat wooden leveling wedge slick with mountain clay that he carried in his tool belt, a simple, unadorned piece of oak used to adjust the tilt of heavy logs before they were permanently pegged into the rock. The wedge was coated in a dense, frozen layer of gray subalpine mud, its grains scarred and flattened by the relentless blows of a heavy beetle. Touching that blunt, clay-stained object brought an immediate somatic recollection of the great central ridgepole resting flat across the granite ledge, entirely free from the necessity of holding up a wall because it had already found the baseline of the mountain. Daesuk stood perfectly still in the center of the smoky hut, his knuckles white against the oak grain. Instead of allowing his old resentment to dictate his hospitality, he chose one small, quiet act of discipline. He paused before speaking, took a single slow breath, and let the crisp, penescented air expand into the base of his spine, allowing the hot thoughts of vengeance to sit on his surface like steam on cold rock without treating a single one of them as an absolute command. In that deliberate interval of physical stillness, A profound realization opened up within his framework, changing his relationship to his own history of grief. He looked at the trembling clerk who had delivered the news of his partner's betrayal, and realized that he no longer needed to carry the anger to prove that the hurt had been real. He saw that the clerk, the guild, and even his departed companion were merely lighter pieces of timber being tossed about by the changing storms of the lower valley, constantly trying to brace themselves against an unpredictable world through contracts and escapes. He stopped resisting the reality of the separation, allowing the empty space in his life to exist without transforming it into a permanent declaration of his own structural failure. He did not pretend that the abandonment had not left a deep, jagged scar across his youth, but he stopped using that scar as a weapon to chip away at his own current integrity. A wave of unpolished, sovereign compassion moved through Dasuk's chest, entirely independent of any desire for an apology or a public vindication. Without a word, he reached into his pack, pulled out his remaining store of dried plums and roasted parched grain, and placed them directly into the hands of the freezing clerk. He then knelt before the low hearth, using his broad shoulders to steady a sagging log so that the heat could reach the traveler's feet more quickly. He did not wait for a word of gratitude, nor did he look up to see if Master Juro was observing his virtue. He simply went about the honest, quiet labor of tending the fire, experiencing for the first time the deep internal equilibrium of a frame that rests entirely on its own foundation. The subalpine night was sealing the high clearing in an absolute uniform dark now, the howling wind outside the stone lianto turning into a distant background murmur. The clean, grounding aroma of the hot pine resin and the damp clay on his leveling wedge hung suspended in the heavy air, drawing Dasuk's attention all the way down into the solid mass of his lower body. He had not achieved a state of magical, effortless perfection, and the loneliness still carried a cold weight during the long winter hours, but he had discovered how to let his solitary timber rest flat on the bedrock without needing to hold up a ghost ceiling for the world to admire. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own ribs soften into this level mattress, allowing your awareness to rest upon the blunt, clay-stained face of the oak wedge as it settles into the quiet depth of the night. This internal paralysis we carry into our nighttime hours is the direct result of a complex, unconscious construction project that the mind mistakenly initiates to protect itself from the cold wind of uncertainty. When a shared future dissolves, or a long-term connection drops away from your life's framework, the immediate response of your nervous system is not to relax into the empty space, but to build an elaborate, invisible scaffolding of defensive calculations. You lie awake under the cover of the dark, your muscles locked into a rigid, vertical alignment, while your intellect relentlessly rehearses the future and replays the past, trying to figure out exactly how the joints failed and who was responsible for the structural collapse. This continuous mental labor is a desperate, frantic bid for control, an illusion that if you can just analyze the failure long enough, or hold your body tightly enough against the void, you can somehow prevent your life from dropping into total ruin. We become deeply habituated to this state of structural resistance, eventually turning the localized pain of a separation into a permanent defining identity. When a partnership fractures, the mind doesn't simply record the event as a changing shift in life's architecture. It takes the broken pieces and builds a monument of self-judgment in the center of your heart. You begin to define yourself as the ruined shelter, the lopsided timber that was inherently unfit to sustain a stable apex, or the person who is destined to remain perpetually exposed to the alpine freeze. To maintain this heavy identity, you are forced to treat every passing thought about your unworthiness as an absolute, undeniable truth, continually picking up the heavy iron mallet of shame to chisel away at your own current baseline. We try to fix ourselves through self-reproach, believing that if we remain hyper-conscious of our perceived defects, we are somehow earning our way back toward safety and validation. But the ancient, quiet clarity of Buddhist wisdom reveals that the true source of your midnight exhaustion is never the empty space itself, but the specific way your mind has chosen to manage the wreckage. Every emotional disaster is composed of two entirely distinct layers: The first pane, which is the raw material that life drops into your clearing, and the second pane, which is the immense, suffocating framework that your thoughts add to the initial fracture. The first pane is the unvarnished reality of the breakage, the cold text message, the empty side of the bed, the diverging life paths, or the blunt truth that human relationships occasionally yield to the changing pressures of time. This initial sting is an occurrence that moves through your timeline like a sudden mudslide. Down a ravine, it leaves a real, stinging heat across your awareness. But it does not possess the capacity to permanently destroy your core stability unless you choose to continuously rehammer the split seam. The second pane is the elaborate maze of psychological resistance, historical regret, and invisible trial scenes that you build around that empty space. The second pane is the voice that takes an accidental separation and transforms it into an absolute sentence of permanent isolation, telling you that because one specific wall has crumbled, your foundation is utterly ruined. We cannot always control the first pane, as life will occasionally shift the earth beneath our structures without asking for our consent, but we have the absolute capacity to stop feeding the secondary scaffolding with our vital energy. Every time you notice your intellect spinning a brilliant Latinite defense or rereading an old argument to find a hidden meaning, and you choose instead to drop your attention straight down into the level weight of your lower ribs, you are starving the second pane of the oxygen it requires to keep your nervous system in a state of permanent alarm. True inner peace, when understood through this rugged, subalpine perspective, is never defined as the total absence of difficulty, loneliness, or structural change. It is not a state of magical numbness where you no longer care about the people who have crossed your threshold. Nor is it a pristine hall that is completely insulated from the mountain storms. Peace is simply a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. It is the capacity to feel the lopsided ache in your chest and the hollow panic in your stomach and realize that your solitary framework is wide enough, heavy enough, and stable enough to contain that raw energy without needing to build an imaginary cantilever over the abyss to bridge the past. You stop treating your feelings of instability as a command to rebuild the old wall immediately, and you begin to discover that your individual skeleton possesses its own central gravity, perfectly capable of balancing its own mass upon the unmoving architecture of the earth. By understanding this internal mechanism, you can finally grant yourself permission to step down from the watchtower and stop trying to solve the entire layout of your relationship history in a single night. You do not have to force your grief to vanish instantly, nor do you need to look for an immediate, dramatic transformation to prove your spiritual worth to the valley below. You can simply allow the empty space to exist as a quiet, unmeasured margin in the room, trusting that the natural, horizontal mass of your body is far too grounded to be shattered by an unwritten future. The heavy timbers of your structure are no longer straining toward an absent rafter. They are dropping straight down, sinking into the deep, protective shelter of a baseline that requires absolutely no external prop to remain entirely whole. Let this horizontal clarity pass from an idea you analyze into a concrete, physical weight that anchors your entire frame to the mattress right now. The clean, crisp aroma of the sheared pine resin and the cold slate within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely unaffected by the chaotic construction projects of the daytime world. Your bones are growing increasingly porous, heavy, and non-reactive, absorbing the deep shadow of the evening without a single condition or judgment. Allow your breathing to become quiet, slow, and horizontal, a soft tide moving through an interior landscape that has completely abandoned the exhausting habit of the lean, resting profoundly within the immense, self-contained safety of your own quiet night. This horizontal, self-stabilizing equilibrium is not an isolated concept, designed to be locked away behind an ancient slate wall, or left entirely on the high, wind-scored ridges of a mountain pass. True inner peace is practiced in the very small, unpolished friction points that make up the raw, demanding texture of your modern daily life. It is found in that exact second when you are lying awake at night, checking your phone for a glimmer of reassurance, watching the small glass screen cast a cold, flickering glow across your bedroom ceiling because a specific message has not arrived. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to treat the digital silence as an absolute architectural collapse, a signal that your individual worth has been permanently compromised, and that you must immediately draft a mental solution to fix the gap. True wisdom begins when you notice that frantic impulse, pause before touching the device, and realize that the delay does not decrease your own internal, skeletal density by a single grain. We live in an accelerated culture that constantly demands we act like perfectly joined, flawless structures, presenting a smiling, symmetrical facade to our social circles, even when our interior framework feels heavy, lopsided, and filled with a thick smoke of unspoken grief. You might find yourself sitting through a long afternoon work call, nodding and cooperating automatically, while a relentless loop of self-criticism plays behind your eyes about a relationship mistake you made months ago. We look at a digital feed. We compare our private, uncarved struggles to the bright, geometric trajectories of those around us, and we instantly decide that we are falling hopelessly behind the conventional timeline of a successful life. The mind creates a false sense of absolute emergency, telling you that if you do not instantly fix your status, your loneliness, or your fractured relationship dynamics by tomorrow morning, you will be permanently excluded from safety. But a profound transformation occurs when you discover that not every frantic thought deserves your active obedience, and not every anxious feeling is an absolute command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of relationship panic prompting you to write a searing reply or force an immediate confrontation to gain control over an uncertain future, you can choose to simply sit with the raw texture of the emptiness rather than running to manipulate the situation. Taking a slow, heavy breath before answering an email or reacting to a challenging remark from a family member is a form of immense internal discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own body that you are no longer a fragile rafter that will crash down at the slightest pull of the wind. You can care deeply about the individuals in your world without gripping their emotional states so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can support them from a place of dense, self-contained mass, like a cool earth mound resting securely in the shadows, rather than as an overstrained wire waiting to be broken by a change in the weather. This also means that you are entirely permitted to drop into an absolute, deep rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity or external validation. Many of us carry a heavy, silent guilt the moment our bodies try to soften, believing that if we are not actively weaving, planning, or resolving a conflict for our environment, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how many arguments you managed to settle before the sun went down. You do not have to settle your entire destiny before you are allowed to close your eyes, nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the lower valleys. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved a perfect pattern of life. It is the natural, native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy, uncarved bedrock of the world. Let this independent perspective occupy your physical awareness right now as you lie beneath the heavy covers of your bed. When the memory of an old blunder or a bitter betrayal tries to pull your attention back up into the hot, friction-filled air of overthinking, let the sheer weight of your bones serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the immediate dark. You can acknowledge that the difficult event occurred without allowing it to dictate the shape of your current night. By choosing to let the memory sit on your surface beneath a thick, moist blanket of non-judgmental presence, you are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to step down from the scaffolding. In a moment, the final echoes of these modern applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your presence without a single condition, measurement, or judgment. You do not need to hold a rigid design for anyone tonight. You are simply a loose, unknotted timber resting undisturbed in the deep shadows of the room, completely hidden, completely non-reactive, and absolutely safe in your own quiet night. The active, balancing friction of your thoughts is beginning to lose its draft now, cooling down into the quiet corners of the room like a heavy layer of damp subalpine clay settling over a deep, dark slate ledge when the long day's storm has spent its energy. The absolute necessity to build an argument, the habit of tracking these historical grievances, and the drive to fix your relationship layout can all be left behind on the mountain floor tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the level support of the bedding with an immense, absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless memory or a midnight calculation. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your throat is cool and spacious, and your ribs are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to scan the dark for a missing partner. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a slow, grounding movement, sinking into the deep, unthreaded chamber that holds your independent rest. There is not a single structural problem left for you to solve tonight. The busy administrative markets of the lower valley have been locked up from the inside. The erratic creaking of the old rafters has stopped, and the voices that demanded you justify your boundaries have withdrawn into the shadows of the ravine. You do not have to take your logistics, your inventory scores, or your defensive habits under the blankets with you. Let yourself slip entirely out of the heavy, rigid harness that you wore to navigate the friction of a broken partnership. You are entering a wide, quiet sanctuary where no arguments are pulled taut, no shared futures are being appraised, and no one is calculating your value based on your visible presentation. The quiet atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute, unmoving security, treating your weariness as a natural, necessary return to the raw, uncarved baseline of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your hips and spine, far beneath the high, vertical structures where attachments are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as a vast, silent timber roof truss filled with dense, cooling pine heartwood, sinking slowly into the cool, dark comfort of an uncelebrated stone shelf. The world may continue to move in its own erratic rhythm, and the unpredictable future may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here on the granite bedrock, there is only a spacious, self-contained silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too deep to be moved by the passing white ash of an old conflict. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to defend your space through constant mental labor. Let the heavy darkness of the night wrap around your shoulders like a protective, damp blanket of mountain moss, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the watchtower now. You have permission to let the coming months remain completely unwritten, to drop the broad-faced iron pitching tool into the dust, and to simply allow your consciousness to unwind into the solid density of the unconditioned dark. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of an immediate victory, sliding out into a deep, vast landscape of sleep where no variables need to be manually held under tension. The breathing has turned into a faint, automatic whisper, a slow and horizontal tide moving through an interior world that has entirely forgotten the rhythm of the lean. You are safe here in the hidden clearing, completely unreacting, completely contained, and profoundly whole in your own solitary mass. When the old wall falls away completely and the heavy central beam lands flat across the bedrock, did you truly lose your structure, or did you finally stop falling? This absolute grounding requires no further justification or alignment, as it remains the permanent, unbending anchor of your awareness, resting silently beneath the shifting memories of the day like the deep, ancient limestone bedrock supporting the entire mountain ridge. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind like an intricate, brittle piece of scaffolding that will completely shatter if we do not constantly shield it from view, continuously striving to present an immaculate, symmetrical exterior for a world that loves to evaluate and critique. But the true, unyielding reality of your presence is that it cannot be permanently warped by a casual snub, a bad camera angle, or a sudden change in another person's emotional weather. Your core being is the very quarry in which all these passing judgments gather and dissolve a ground that remains absolutely dense, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many critical glances still echo through the village markets. Consider how the unworked block of black basalt behind the old timber wall does not retain the frantic vibration of the hammers that echoed through the yard during the morning. It does not argue with the masonry layout. It does not hold a grudge against the hand that cast it aside into the weeds. And it does not worry whether its uneven texture will be celebrated by the temple priests tomorrow. It simply surrenders its physical mass to the absolute stillness of the ground, completely content to return to its native quiet state as a sovereign piece of mountain stone. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting, nocturnal requirement to be an answer to every standard, an administrator of outcomes, or a perfect reflection of someone else's aesthetic timeline. You can allow the external world to move in its own volatile currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be consumed by an uncelebrated hour. Let this release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your ribs and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat a perceived physical defect or a moment of social isolation as an immediate emergency that must be instantly settled through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the night. You do not have to fight the self-conscious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into a state of artificial silence. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or social validation. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine stone dust drifting down into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor frustrations, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay accepted by the crowd, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the masonry yard. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This deep horizontal alignment with the granite bedrock acts as an absolute, unmoving anchor for your tired nervous system, grounding your somatic self far below the superficial currents of historical regret or future panic. We pass our waking hours holding our breath in the presence of change, desperately maintaining a rigid, invisible scaffolding behind our expressions out of a persistent fear that our true solitary nature will be judged as fractured or incomplete. But the profound reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be diminished by an unreturned look, an unwritten future, or the sudden departure of a companion from your life's framework. Your core being is the vast, quiet expanse in which all these passing architectural shadows arise and dissolve a baseline of pure, unbothered awareness that remains entirely whole and unyielding regardless of how much or how little of the old structure remains standing in the valley below. Consider how an ancient, moss-covered timber resting at the edge of a high alpine path does not grieve when the roof it once supported falls away, and the laborers have all departed for the night. It does not look back at the building years with a sense of personal failure, nor does it tense its internal grain in anticipation of the storms that will pass across its surface tomorrow. It simply surrenders its immense mass to the dark, completely content to be exactly what it is, a quiet, unyielding boundary that asks for nothing but the freedom to rest flat against the earth. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of total non-resistance tonight, dropping the exhausting psychological requirement to be an answer to every relational standard, a perfect reflection of a shared dream, or a tireless rebuilder of a decayed wall. You can let the external world move in its own volatile loops, knowing that your inner landscape is far too dense to be fractured by an unrecorded hour. Let this structural release travel deep into your physical frame, softening the small, subconscious pockets of vigilance that still linger behind your collarbones and beneath your eyelids. For so long, your body has been trained to treat a quiet, empty margin as a dangerous vacuum that must be immediately filled with self-criticism, anxiety, or complex planning to justify your space in the world. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this continuous internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the anxious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into an artificial numbness. You can simply allow the loneliness or the disorientation to exist as a faint, harmless echo on your surface, trusting that it will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or public approval. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight environment. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound rest. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine stone dust melting back into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of words now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the earth. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor anxieties, the persistent whisper that you are falling behind the conventional design of a successful life, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the coastline. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This uncarved, self-contained stillness requires no further reinforcement or validation, as it remains the permanent, unyielding foundation of your awareness, resting quietly beneath the shifting memories of the day, like the massive hidden granite shelves that anchor the entire mountain ridge. We spend our waking hours treating our sense of security like a delicate, unstable frame that will collapse if we do not constantly brace it against external circumstances, continuously striving to align our lives with the expectations of a changing world. But the true, indestructible reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be dismantled by an empty space, an unreturned sentiment, or a sudden shift in your life's design. Your core being is the very clearing in which all these passing structural adjustments arise and dissolve a space that remains perfectly dense, balanced, and complete regardless of how many pieces of your old plans have returned to the earth. Consider how a fallen timber resting flat across a slate ledge does not carry the memory of its old vertical strain into the deep silence of the winter night. It does not argue with the wind that stripped away its shelter. It does not worry about the rafters that have departed into the lower valleys. And it does not try to measure its current position against the buildings that still stand in the towns below. It simply drops its entire mass into the absolute support of the mountain, completely content to return to its native, horizontal state as a sovereign piece of heartwood. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting, nocturnal habit of leaning your life against a ghost connection, or trying to hold up a ceiling that the universe has already cleared away. You can allow the external world to move in its own unpredictable currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be broken by a lonely hour. Let this structural release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your chest and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat a sudden separation or a broken future as an immediate emergency that must be actively managed through endless loops of analysis before you are permitted to soften. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal rebuilding is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the night. You do not have to fight the disoriented thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to force your grief to vanish instantly. You can simply allow the emptiness to exist as a quiet, unmeasured margin on your surface, trusting that its frantic energy will naturally run out of momentum if you choose to drop your weight directly onto the bedrock below. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless symmetry or relational validation. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of replaying a mistake to find a different outcome, or of comparing your isolated timeline to the shared trajectories of others, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no judge assessing your independent posture, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine sawdust drifting down into the cool mountain clay. The understanding has moved past the level of words now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of the day, the plans left unfulfilled, the minor anxieties, the persistent whisper that your solitary life is not enough to stay safe, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the forest. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival. or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.